What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another Hellbound Garage. Today we are finally getting the flatbed all coated, but first I have to prep it, so let's roll right into it and get this thing started. So the first thing that I need to do is get rid of the mill scale off this large panel, and unfortunately my entire flatbed is covered in mill scale because I did not do any of the prep work before assembling it. Simply because if I were to strip it all down to the bare metal, it would just rust over and I would have to do this all over again anyways. If you look on the internet or YouTube, you're going to find a whole host of ways of removing mill scale off panels. The problem is most of those solutions are meant for small pieces or flat pieces, not something like diamond plate. This is both a large piece and a textured piece, and that brings a certain level of problem to stripping, and there's really only two ways at this point in order to get the mill scale off, and that is to either one, use acid, which honestly I don't like dealing with. I've used it in the past, and then there's this way, which is sandblasting. You're seeing here is a Harbor Freight sandblaster along with a 25-gallon air compressor. Unfortunately, that size air compressor, you run out of air pressure about a minute to 2 minutes worth of blasting, and then you have to wait for the compressor to catch up, and it just takes a very long time. As you can see in the time lapse, I went from day to night, back to day, just to finish this one panel. It probably took me 8 hours worth of time between waiting for the compressor to catch up and actually blast time, but it was also still the most efficient way of going about doing that process. If I had something in the realm of a two-stage, like 50-gallon compressor, then this would have not taken near as long because I could have just continuously run the air compressor until I had this all blasted instead of waiting for my single stage to catch up. Unfortunately, I just don't have the electrical to do that right at this moment. This next little segment is just me going through and finishing up the mounts for the flatbed. I did just take square stock and cut it as a triangle shape and then welded it to the end of it with no real measurements beforehand. So after I got it welded to the frame, I had to cut down the mounts themselves and then just weld the tops, so that way I could make sure that no water got in behind and rusted out the frame in a really weird spot. At this point, I'm just going through the rest of the frame with a flap disc and a grinder and getting rid of as much mill scale as possible because the tube itself is all flat. It was relatively easy, and this is honestly just a simple way of getting rid of the mill scale, especially if you don't care about like the little nicks and scratches that are left behind by a coarse flap disc. If you are going to paint over this area, then I probably wouldn't recommend it, just because the flat disc will leave like cuts in the metal that are deeper than what you really want. But because this is being coated, I didn't really have to worry about that near as much as if it was going to be a painted surface. And we busted out the trusty engine hoist to get the flatbed off the truck. This will just make it easier for me to go through and hit the different angles of the flatbed and to continue getting as much mill scale off as possible. One thing that's not shown in this is that I did use the sandblaster on this diamond plate panel here, as well as the panel where the taillights sit. I just figured it wasn't worth showing every last little bit of the whole process. It does get kind of tedious and boring, and man, were my arms tired after this was all said and done. But if you want good adhesion to your metal, this is just the kind of thing you gotta do in order to make sure that that happens. Otherwise, you are coating on top of the mill scale, which some people don't have any problems with. On smaller panels, even I don't have a problem with it. But there's the chance of that mill scale cracking if the flatbed ever flexes, and then it just automatically pops all the paint off and everything else, and it just becomes one big mess. So prep is 90% of the job, followed by the actual results. And yeah, this is just a little bit of what it took to get this all ready. I do want to note that at this point I did switch from a flap wheel to this nylon bristled brush attachment, and it worked really good, where I had welded the angle iron to the square tubing to get as much grime and gunk away from that area. It didn't attack the mill scale like I had seen in other people's videos. which I was kind of sad about, but it did still help with the overall finish. Alright guys, I am physically exhausted and just mentally tired too. Fighting mill scale on that thing and that thing for, at this point, 2 days. I know the video doesn't show it. It's kind of hard justifying showing that much grinding and blasting and just annoyance with this whole process, but I want this coating to last for a while because the bed itself is going to last, and I plan on having the truck for a long time. It's just one of those things, but He-Man-ing this thing all over the place is just, it's a chore without some of the tools that, you know, commercial shops have, like lifts and hoists and stuff, and an actual blast cabinet. Like this is, it's a real struggle, but you know, we managed to get this far. I used some purple power and rinsed down everything. Tomorrow I'll go through with some real solvents, finish up some minor things, and then hopefully we'll be able to start doing the paint and then the top coat after that. So, but anyways, that's gonna do it for tonight. I'll be back in the morning. Everybody, it's the next morning. I managed to do some work before the video. A couple of things that just really stuck with me last night was, one, how am I going to paint all this all at once and get it coated all at once? And two was my brackets, these guys here. They stuck up pretty far, and I just wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do. Like, they're strong, like they're super strong, but if I use this for what I'm going to in the future, I'm not sure if these brackets were going to be strong enough. So I added little gussets on the inside of every last one. So that way it gives that extra strength for this direction. I was just going to weld it along the side here, and it just made more sense to do a gusset. And down there is my massive pile of rags, both lint and lintless rags. I've gone over the entire frame, mostly, and wiped everything down, first with degreaser and then with a wax and grease remover, to make sure that I get as good of a surface as I possibly can to spray the epoxy primer that I want to before I do the actual coating. I don't have to do the epoxy primer step, but just one of those extra things because we're in the Midwest and everything likes to rust. So I got that, so now I can finally get to the painting. It is really windy today, so I'm not sure that's going to affect a lot of this. And as far as painting this and coating this, I'm going to have to do it in stages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the whole top side that you see here, which is actually the bottom. I'm going to get that painted, get that coated, and then I can flip it over and do the top side, both paint and coat. And hopefully this works because I'm only hitting the surfaces that you see. If for whatever reason when I go to spray the primer on the top and it hits the bottom side, you're not going to see any of that. Like, it's underneath the truck. You're never going to see it. So that's the only reason I'm doing it this way, because you're not going to see it unless you're underneath the truck, and no one should be underneath the truck besides myself. So let's get to spraying, and hopefully the weather kind of holds out so I can get this done without it blowing everywhere, but I doubt it. finally have the first coat on the flatbed. I do have to wait roughly an hour for it to tack up, hopefully, so I can lay the second coat on the bottom side before I flip it over and do the top side. I do have to give it a decent amount of cure time, which I think is going to be overnight. That way it's as cured as possible before I flip it over, and hopefully then I don't damage any of the coating when I do and go flip it over. Mother Nature is trying its hardest to be part of the flatbed. The wind is a real problem right now, and because it's fall, all the leaves are blowing onto it, so I'm constantly having to pick leaves off. But what are you gonna do when you get this nice of weather this time of year? You gotta take it. But anyways, I think I will check back in with you tomorrow after I have flipped this over and started coating the top side. Maybe we can get the bed back on the truck by tomorrow. We'll find out. I don't know. Side note, this is what happens when you try and spray with a windy environment and Mother Nature says no. Yeah. Color of my skin, epoxy primer, undercoating. And even though I put plastic underneath the flatbed, my driveway has got a light dusting of epoxy primer on it. Luckily, because it's also covered in sand, most of it is just blowing right off. But that's what happens when you try to paint outside without a booth. Yay. Well, if you couldn't tell, I had a bad news, good news, bad news, good news kind of situation. Let me explain. Bad news. Shortly after my last clip, it decided to rain, and I wasn't expecting that. I don't know what made me do it, but after I'd finished, got cleaned up, went inside, I checked the weather, and lo and behold, at like midnight that night for like an hour, it was supposed to rain. And I'm like, shoot, I still have bare metal because I ran out of epoxy primer that I was gonna go get the next day to finish when I flipped the flatbed over. It was a whole mess. Good news though, I got the bare metal coated. Bad news is I had to use the stuff in a can, the self-etching in a can, instead of using the epoxy primer. So, you know, bad news there. Good news, it stopped the rain from getting any rust on the bare metal that was still exposed. So, not a bad deal there. Bad news is it didn't adhere the way I would have liked it to, like it did with the epoxy primer, because I didn't have time to clean the metal like I did before the epoxy primer. So it like dried weird. It saved the metal, but it dried weird, so I had to go through the next day with a wire wheel and knock all of, well, a good portion of it off, as well as like the little mounds or the droplets that formed from the bed liner as it was dripping off the material, because now the material that was upside down is right side up. So I had to knock that down. But I got it all taken care of. I had like a 4 or 5 hour time span between when I got done with work and when it was going to rain next. So it rained at midnight, held off, and then rained the next night, and then the whole next day. So we got it done, but it wasn't necessarily the way I really wanted it to be done. So, yeah. Am I really happy? Not really. Am I really mad? Not really. I'm kind of somewhere in between. I will just have to watch what happens with the material now that I know I have 2 different primers underneath all of it to see if it rusts in the future or if the bed liner coating comes off. I don't know. We'll see what happens. To say that Mother Nature messed with my emotions that night and the next day is definitely an understatement. I was not a happy person to have to rush the process and do it, you know, kind of subpar. But it got done either way. So here in a little bit, I'm gonna have my dad stop by and help me get the flatbed back onto the truck so that turd starts to actually look like a truck again. I would normally just use ratchet straps and my engine hoist to lift it up and get it back on the truck, but with the new coating, I just don't really want to ruin this nice, fresh coat right off the bat. It's still probably soft, you know, it takes a couple days to fully harden, and I don't want to chance it, so he's going to come over and help me. That way I can enjoy the truck looking nice a little bit before I start using it and eventually beat it up. Alright, that wraps up getting the flatbed back on the truck and making the truck back to being drivable. I noticed in the last time lapse of me wiring up the lights, you didn't really get to see a whole lot, honestly. The angle was wrong and I was just going at it. I was very focused on what I was doing and it got cold. I mean, to the point where my hands didn't want to move right by the time I got done, but I got it done anyways. With the wiring, I used these little guys, and these are open barrel splices. This is one of my preferred ways of actually wiring up vehicles. These with some like marine grade heat shrink that's got the adhesive on the inside as well as the heat shrink itself. Just makes for a very secure seal, and that way you don't have to worry about moisture getting in it. But overall, she's on the truck. Looking pretty good, right? And look, there's a bonus. I got on Facebook Marketplace and this dude was selling welding tanks for a steal. So I had zero choice but to go get them. So I rushed to make sure that I had license plate lights just in case it got dark. And I went and got those so that way I can stop using that little itty bitty tank on projects that are this size. Even though the truck is at this point, it's not actually street legal. It's drivable, but it's not street legal. I'm sure if I did this number, you could probably tell what it still needs. If you can't, well, then you have to tune into the next episode to see how this truck becomes 100% road legal, as well as we're going to put in some final touches on the base flatbed for the Tundra. Then I can finally get into all the cool accessory things that I want to build for it, but we got to get the base done before we can get all the cool accessories done. So, thank you for watching. Thank you for your support. Until the next one. What it takes, I ain't making mistakes like that. I'll put it on your face to make you go take it.